Well, first of all, I'd just like to thank you. It is an absolute honor to have you join us with the Oxford Political Review this year. I just want to start with a question on manufacturing consent and your thesis on it, where you previously suggested that, back when you wrote it, anti-communism and the war on terror were examples of filters employed as major social control mechanisms. What do you see as the primary social mechanisms in Western news today? And what do you see their counterparts as in non-Western countries or democracies?
After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a sort of an interim period when there was a search for something new to be the pretext for military intervention and so on. And actually that interim period is quite interesting because the clouds were lifted and pronouncements were pretty interesting and accurate. So you learn a lot about policy by looking at those views. Historians unfortunately sort of avoid it, but it's very interesting. So George Bush the first was the president, leading out with a pretty strategy, Pentagon budget. Clinton administration came in with some strategic command document on essentials of post-Cold War deterrence, all those things. Said, there's not going to be any peace dividend. Forget it. We have to maintain a huge system. Why? Because of the technological sophistication of third world countries. Nobody laughed. We have to maintain this industrial base, which is a euphemism for the high-tech industry that largely subsidized. The creative, innovative work is usually done by the publicly funded institutions and handed over to private corporations for marketing and profit, the way the system works. We have to maintain that. Thirdly, we have to maintain aimed at the Middle East. And then came an interesting phrase, where the reasons for intervention have been laid at the Kremlin's door. In other words, we've been lying to you for 50 years. It wasn't the Russians that made us have intervention forces. It was what's called radical nationalism. Those are the core principles that were enunciated in the interim period.
Yeah.
Some new pretexts began to come. One of them was what you said, global war on terror. Another was the concept of humanitarian, which has been used in very interesting ways. Coming to the modern period, we have the enormous threat of Iran is one of the major issues now. Iran is the greatest global threat, constantly reiterated. We have to protect ourselves from the Iranian threat. It's a very interesting claim. There happens to be an extremely simple way to prevent any alleged threat of Iranian nuclear weapons. Very simple, straightforward. Institute a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Is very intense and very effective. We've seen the effectiveness of inspections with the JCPOA, which Iran lived up to complete. So how about moving to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone? Well, is there a problem? Iran is strongly in favor of it, vociferously, in fact. The G77, the former non-aligned countries, about 130 countries, strongly in favor of it. One problem, US won't allow it. The issue comes up at the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty review sessions every 5 years, vetoed by the United States.
Sorry, do you think a nuclear free zone is likely given Russia and China's sort of new incentives with regards to not necessarily aggression, but definitely their defensiveness in the region of the Middle East?
But Russia certainly is. Russia supported the Assad government. Russia invaded a country in the Middle East. Has Russia done anything like what Britain did in invading Iraq?
What do you think of the claim that Russia might have played a role in the 2016 US elections then?
Yeah, there were high-level investigations by National Academy and others. They could find no detectable effect of Russian intervention. But the whole issue is very interesting.
On the subject of elections, resuming our conversation just then, I agree with you that there's an issue of lobbying and dominance of big money in American elections. Now let's talk about the 2020 elections and what's going on right now. What is your read on a Democratic field, and how can the Democrats win against Trump?
Well, the first thing the Democrats have to do is to stop working for Trump. They're his best ally. It's incredible how they're shooting themselves in the foot. So take this furor over impeachment. It was obvious from the first moment that the impeachment issue would be a huge gift to Trump. In order to get impeachment through the Senate, you have to have 2/3 of the vote. The Republican Party is in Trump's pocket. They're owned by Trump. The senators have zero integrity. They're terrified of Trump's base. It's perfectly obvious they're all going to vote to acquit Trump no matter what he does. Okay, that was obvious in advance. Therefore, it was plain that the outcome of the impeachment hearings would be a grand victory for Trump. Acquittal, victory, defeated the deep state and so on. Furthermore, if you watch the impeachment hearings, they were a total farce from the first moment. They opened with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, solemnly swearing in the senators, each of whom pledged, with their hand on their heart, that they would vote on the basis of the evidence, no partisan bias whatsoever. I think Roberts was trying very hard to keep a straight face because everybody knew they were going to vote exactly on party lines and behave exactly on party lines as they did. So it began with a farce, continued with a farce, came to the predictable outcome, great gift to Trump. If the Democrats want desperately to have him win the election, they can keep doing that. The other thing they could do is to turn to the issues. Turns out most of the public supports democratic positions, at least theoretical ones, on most of the issues. So turn to those. Forget the nonsense of trying to impeach Trump on something for which he's probably guilty, but nobody cares. In fact, if you look at his poll results, when the impeachment hearings started, he had about 40% approval, went up about 10% during the hearings, perfectly predictably. Now, there is a choice that the Democrats have to make a choice between candidates like Bernie Sanders, who have substantial popular appeal and support, and someone who appealed to the Clinton New Democrats, kind of like Blair's New Labor, the conservative mainstream establishment Democrats. They hope Biden is sort of falling behind, maybe Bloomberg. They have to make that choice. That's a very serious one. Sanders has the advantage of having a popular, energized, mobilized organization working for him, mostly young people, which can do much of the groundwork for the election and support, and there's a lot of support for his policies. On the other hand, he's hated by the establishment. And I think he's not only the Democratic National Committee, but also the media, which are vilifying him. Very similar to the Corbin situation in England. And I think probably at the root, there's something quite similar. It's not Sanders' policies that infuriate the establishment. And whatever he calls himself, his policies are basically extensions of the New Deal. they wouldn't have surprised Dwight Eisenhower very much. But the threat that he poses is inspiring a mass popular movement, which doesn't show up every couple of years to push a lever, but keeps working constantly to change policy, to influence what's happening, to mobilize, to organize, to demonstrate. And that's not the way the public's supposed to act.
And how do you think Bernie could sort of appeal to the mass public? Because it seems to a lot of us who do have sympathies towards him that he just needs to win what we call the sort of centrist or medium voter. Do you think that's a myth, or do you think that the swing voter, in that sense, the sort of centrist voter, does exist and should be appealed to in order to win the election?
It's a consideration that has to be taken into account, but it cuts both ways, notice. I mean, Sanders will certainly, in fact does, alienate much of the establishment, basically kind of New Democrat centrists. They hate him. And there's parts of the population that don't like his policies at all. On the other hand, he has the advantage of the only candidate who has the advantage of mass-based popular organization working for him. If he doesn't get chosen, there's a very good chance that that large mass group will, to a large extent, either abstain or even vote for Trump, as happened in 2016. On the other hand, there's what you mentioned, a centrist candidate, say Biden or Bloomberg, would appeal to the more established, more affluent centrist population. So there's a decision to be made.
Would you personally endorse or back Sanders again, considering that you stood up to... I believe you endorsed Sanders in 2016. I was wondering if you'd personally support Sanders again for this year's election.
Would I endorse, say, Biden?
No, Sanders.
Who?
Bernie Sanders.
Clinton? Bernie Sanders. Would I?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, he'd be my favorite candidate, but there is the consideration that you mentioned. Can't disregard it. If Sanders runs, he will be subject to a campaign of vilification and denunciation and lies and hysteria, which will be very hard to deal with. Actually, you saw this in the case of Corbin.
I would want to push back against your analogy between Corbin and Sanders, because as someone who's quite sympathetic to Bernie, I am less sympathetic to Corbin in that I think he presents a platform for left-wing views that leads to not just self-defeatingness, but also alienates individuals of particular ethnicities or of particular views that he hasn't necessarily spoken out for or in defense of. So I'm thinking of Jewish members of the Labour Party who felt alienated by Corbyn's leadership. And whatever we think of his personal views, I don't know. But it seems that Bernie, unlike Corbyn, is more able to rally people around him, even if they come from different backgrounds. And I think that's a difference between Sanders and Corbyn.
There are differences. Corbyn was very ineffective in responding to the streams of vilification and denunciation, just was kind of passive. He's not a fighter, I think he's a very decent human being, but not a political fighter. The other issue in England, which doesn't arise in the United States, is Brexit, which pushed everything to the side, and Corbyn's vacillation on that cost him a lot. On the other hand, if you look at the polls in England, it seems that the 2017 policies that led to the huge Labour victory are still quite popular. And that analogy, to not Brexit and the other things, does hold in the United States. But I think it's kind of an uncertain decision about popular support versus electability, or mobilization versus electability. Personally, I think that Sanders would be the best choice. But if you want to see the kind of campaign that's coming against him, take a look at the liberal press. I mean, there's an article in the Washington Post a couple of days ago from one of their main liberal correspondents, which was just a vicious personal attack on Sanders, his clothes, the way he looks, the way he sits, his body language, anything you could attack. And as soon as the Republican machine gets started, it's going to go over the top. They have no limit. If you want a sense of what's going to happen, take a look at the last Brazilian election a year ago. I happened to be there at the time. On the social media, there was an outpouring of massive denunciation, vilification, lies about the Workers' Party. They're going to turn all your children into homosexuals, we're going to kill religion, this, that, and the other thing. And it's very hard to deal with. A lot of the population in Brazil, much of the population gets their information from social media. This is utterly swamped. I'm sure the Republican machine is gearing up to do the same thing. And with the liberal media also attacking Sanders, it's going to be quite an ugly proceeding.
I think that's very fair. I guess just to wrap up very quickly this section on US politics, there's always been this defense in UK or US politics that a lot of left-wing politicians are vilified by the media. But don't you think that an effective media strategy and ability to talk to the media, to play the media game whilst not losing the real message, isn't that what a real left-wing politician in an age of social media needs to be able to have in order to overcome the part and parcel of politics in that sense?
The best way to respond to streams of vilification, denunciation, lies, and so on, is to give a simple, straightforward response, then ignore them and turn to the major issues. So, for example, what we were discussing a moment ago about Iran is vastly more significant than anything we are now talking about. Let's go back and think about it for a minute. The greatest threat to peace, the greatest threat we face is supposed to be Iranian nuclear weapons. There's a very simple way to solve the problem. The government won't do it because they have to protect Israel's nuclear arsenal. Okay, that's an extremely important fact. Well, nobody will talk about it. What people prefer to talk about is Russian interference or something. But this is only one example of things that are greatly significant that the population would care about. That solves our security problem. There's something much more significant. Now, President Trump, in my opinion, is this will sound outrageous, but it's correct, the most dangerous person in human history. Hitler wanted to kill 6 million Jews, Roma, homosexuals, 30 million Slavs, but he didn't want to destroy the prospect for organized human life forever. Trump does.
I would beg to differ, Noam, that I think Hitler certainly tried to destroy the organized, very basis of humanity and dignity by his systemic persecution and killing of Jews, whereas Trump, as much as I think he is dangerous and totalitarian, is not necessarily enacting a genocide or persecution of people of that scale or to that capacity or anywhere near that extent.
Much greater. His climate policies are leading the way to the end of organized human life in any form that we know in the near future. Every day, first of all, not only is it, most of the countries in the world, with a few exceptions like Australia, are trying to do at least something to deal with a very severe impending crisis. Trump is alone in not only refusing to do anything, but working to accelerate the disaster, racing towards disaster. And just this morning, for example, once again, new fields were opened in Utah for oil exploration. He's cut back all regulations. And he knows exactly what he's doing. One of his bureaucracies, National Transportation Bureaucracy, put out a very interesting document, long, detailed environmental assessment for the coming years. Now, they concluded that by the end of the century, temperatures will have risen 4 degrees centigrade Celsius over pre-industrial levels. That's absolutely catastrophic. Take a look at the scientific evidence. That's way beyond anything that makes human life viable. And they draw conclusions from it. They said, therefore, we should not impose any regulations on emissions for cars and trucks. Why? Well, we're going over the cliff anyway, so let's have fun while we have it time. Can you think of a document like that in human history? That's the Trump administration. These are the worst criminals who have ever existed. This is not discussed at all. Take a look at the other major threat we face, nuclear war. It's very serious. You may have seen the doomsday clock setting a couple of weeks ago of the atomic scientists. Closest we've ever been to midnight since 1947. What is Trump doing? Tearing to shreds the remaining arms control agreements. Just destroyed the INF agreement. Open Skies is on the chopping block. Won't sign New START. So it's vastly increasing the dangers of even survival. Nobody talks about this. We talk about did the Russians interfere.
That is fair. I was just going to follow up on that because I want to ask you for your thoughts on China's rise, because given America's declining role, or rather its dangerous behaviors as a global leader, what do you make of China's possible takeover of the USA as maybe a counterbalancing force to US? If not, does it provide an alternative mode of governance that is worse or better? What do you make of China?
What do I make of? First of all, let's talk about American decline. We just saw a very dramatic illustration of that. The Trump administration came out about a week ago with the greatest deal of the century, plan for Middle East peace. Suppose China had come out with a plan for Middle East peace. How would you have responded? How would anybody have responded? Would have yawned and turned to the next topic. But when the United States comes out with it, everybody heeds it. That's the plan. The Lord has spoken. We now talk about how we can implement it, or is it good or bad or so on. Is that decline? I mean, that's a recognition on the part of the world that the US owns and runs the world. If China had come out with a plan, or Russia or Germany or anyone else, you'd barely wave your hand on it. American dominance of the world is overwhelming, and people concede it. Take, say, again, the joint agreement on nuclear weapons with Iran. Trump pulled out of the agreement. Europe theoretically stayed in, but they immediately backed off and agreed with Trump because they have no choice. US power is so overwhelming, and US threat to the world is so extreme that everyone backs off. Europe, in fact, they had reasons. When the US imposes sanctions on a country, and notice that the US is the only country that can impose sanctions. China doesn't impose sanctions. Russia doesn't. Germany doesn't. The US does all over the place because of its overwhelming power, and that's taken for granted. But when the US impose sanctions, they are not just sanctions on the country targeted, but on everybody. If anyone dares to violate US sanctions on Iran or Cuba or whoever, they'll be kicked out of the international financial system because the US controls it. I mean, in comparison, China is it's a growing country, but it's a poor country. Take a look at its ranking in the UN, the Human Development Index, ranks about 90th. Poor country with very severe internal problems, ecological, many others, brutal regime. expanding, undoubtedly, but it's so far behind the United States in just about every respect that talk of its taking over the world is kind of like, the fantasies about Russia during the Cold War or other fantasies that are.
That is very fair. And I just want to sort of follow up with a slightly unrelated question, going back to your theoretical works on anarchism and anarchy. I'm a fan of philosophical anarchism. I subscribe to a lot of the arguments that Simmons or you provide concerning it. But what do you think are the preconditions required for anarchy to succeed? And do you think anarchism would ever become the dominant mode of governance in a world as we see it today or in 100 years' time?
If you had asked in the 18th century, early 18th century, whether political democracy is possible, what would you say? We don't know. I mean, I don't see, first of all, we have to ask what anarchism is. I mean, at root, what it is the demand that structures of hierarchy and domination justify their existence. They have to justify themselves. They're not self-justifying. And if they can't justify themselves, they should be dismantled. And they're all over the place. So like a core example, critical example, wage labor. Should wage labor even be tolerated? I mean, what does wage labor mean? Suppose you get a job in some corporation. You're entering a tyranny of a kind that goes way beyond any totalitarian government. Stalin didn't try to tell people when you're allowed to go to the bathroom, or what clothes you have to wear, or whether you can stop for a minute to talk to a friend. But if you take a job, you're subjecting yourself to that tyranny. Is there any justification for that? Why should people spend most of their waking lives as subordinate creatures, dependent creatures, under the orders of masters? Actually, for almost all of human history, that's been regarded as an abomination. From Cicero in classical Rome up to the mid-19th century, it's a pretty long time, that was regarded as totally intolerable. You get to say Abraham Lincoln in the mid-19th century. Wage labor was equivalent to slavery, except that it was temporary. You could get out of it and become an independent, free person. Working people accepted that. In the early Industrial Revolution, working people fought hard to try to create an industrial system in which the slogan was, those who work in the mills will own them. It took a long time for this to be beaten out of their heads. Now, finally, in the 20th century, most people accept it, but they shouldn't. They should struggle against that. There's no reason at all to accept that kind of hierarchy. Now, will it end? Can't tell. There are seeds of ending it all over the place. Some of them very substantial, like Mondragon, others smaller. Can these spread and develop? We can't predict it. Now, that would be one major step towards freedom and dignity and control of one's life. It would be a step towards an enlightenment ideal, the ideal that, I'll just quote a leading figure of modern classical liberalism.
But with the advancement of mechanization of labor, do you think this utopian ideal could be achieved, given that workers, primarily in a sort of anarchist world of self-organization, the reason why people would come together and live peacefully is because of some degree of codependence? But if mechanization and automation can take over human beings in supplying these essential goods and services, wouldn't that mean that we stray further and further away from ever attaining that possibility of egalitarian codependence, because we can instead bank on machines and capital? And that's a massive threat to communal structures.
First, let's once again separate fantasy from fact. The situation now, there's a lot of hype about the terrors of automation. First of all, what's happening? Is there any detectable effect of automation so far? Well, there's an easy way to check that. If automation was having a new impact other than what's been happening for a century, we would see it in increase in growth of productivity. It's automatic. Have fewer workers, you have greater productivity. Is there a growth of productivity? No, there's a decline. Our productivity growth is less than it has been during the years of, so it's often called the golden age of capitalism, 50s and 60s, the temps glorieuse, as they call it in French. It's lower than that. So we're not seeing an effect, but there will be an effect sooner or later. How that effect plays out depends on the social, political conditions under which it develops. So automation could be used to undermine working people in their lives. It could be used to free them from onerous, dangerous tasks that they don't want to carry out, and to free them for more creative, independent lives. Could be a great boon. Depends on the conditions under which it takes place.
That is very fair. And just to close off or wrap it our discussion, Professor, I want to ask you, what would be your proudest legacy and achievement, given your illustrious records and your extensive works? What is something you're proudest of, I think, in terms of your theory and your research that you'd like to highlight, perhaps?
That's for other people to decide. Of course, I'd like things that I'm interested and concerned with to be pursued and developed in the future, but that's up to people like you, not for me to decide.
Well, I just want to thank you once again for your time. That was a real pleasure and a real honor to be able to speak with you. And if you could close with words or any thoughts on how, as Democrats, we can, no, not Democrats in American sense, but Democrats at large, how can we make democracy perhaps work again? Is it about going back to the fundamental issues that you said just then? Is it about fixing those problems right at the core of capitalism? Or is there even more that we need to start getting to do in order to make democracy a politic for all, or a polity for all in that sense?
I think maybe one thing to keep in mind is the slogan that Gramsci made famous: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. There are huge problems. People of your generation are facing questions that have never arisen in human history. Will organized human society and millions of other species survive in any recognizable form? Now that question is urgent, cannot be delayed, has to be answered soon. Now there are solutions. For every problem you can think of, there are easy solutions. I mentioned, didn't have much time, but I mentioned one, the problem of Iranian nuclear weapons. Trivial solution. Look at other cases, there are also answers. But you have to have the will to pursue them. They're not going to be answered by themselves. That requires attention, engagement, understanding, dedication. Then the problem's going to be solved. Otherwise, we're finished.
Great. Thank you so much for your time, Professor. It was a real pleasure. And thank you. Have a lovely day.